Good. That's actually not bad either. Pretty comfy. Hey everybody, Tom Kaczynski here. I just want to do a sound and video check. Make sure you guys can all see me okay. So welcome to, what am I calling it? Central Intel Unscripted, right? Until I find a name I actually like. I hope you're all having a wonderful week, wonderful weekend. I want to thank everyone who's here. Remind you, anyone who wants to send a little help, super chats are enabled, or you can send a Venmo at CVCPRV, as well as you could potentially send something to the old PO box here. So keep me doing this, day to day, and we will go in a minute. So I hope you're all doing well. Let me just write this down. I just got in from watering the plants. So I'm always late for the show by a few minutes, right? So that's one of the things that happens because I'm out there watering the plants. But maybe this weekend I'll do a little brief episode out back. You guys always ask me how that's doing, and we'll go through that. So I want to go through a lot of different things tonight. We'll touch on a lot of points. I've really been in seclusion a little bit, and quite intentionally. I've been doing a lot of work. I should put this here. Let me just do this real fast here. I've been doing a lot of work for things that I really wanted to be able to do that are bigger in scope, but that require me to pay a lot of attention. So a lot of times what ends up happening is, we'll delete this after 2 hours here, upload that. Give me 1 second here, viewer links, okay. And we'll save that for later. Okay, so one of the things that I've been doing is I've been trying to solve some of the problems that's out there, looking at the larger social pictures. I'm getting back into political speech and all the things that are happening right now. So we definitely want to do that. Oh, my problem is that I don't know what time it is, Eki. I'm really bad about keeping the time because I did a lot of things. I had to take care of that for sure. But anyway, so let me start this. We'll start by talking a little bit about the virus, just because I want to start there and then go to other places. As we might have expected, we're seeing shutdowns happen in Texas, Arizona, Florida, and states throughout the southern band that opened up quickly. Not altogether surprising. One question I continue to have, I don't have an answer for you, is why we are seeing such a lower death rate. Is it that the doctors now have a better understanding of the disease and are fighting it more effectively? Let's hope so. That's a really good outcome if, in fact, that's the case. Or is it something where the disease has modified to be less harmful? I don't really know if that's the case. I'm not reading lab reports day after day. I've literally been doing the hermit on the hill thing. So I don't have a very good answer for you. I wish I did, but I don't. So we'll have to keep an eye on it. But I will tell you one thing. So I think they're going to try to reinstitute lockdowns. And Lord knows that DeSantis and Abbott are no one's ideas of people who are going to be tough on those questions. Nonetheless, the fact that they're doing it, I think, suggests that at least we should consider taking it seriously. But I've also reached a point in this where I don't think anything is going to keep very well. I don't think the measures that are out there that are being suggested by the CDC and other actors are actually effective at keeping people safe. So at this point, I think lockdowns end up being a little bit foolish if we have social distancing and other measures that wouldn't work for a disease who we really don't understand. So my advice is going to be somewhat different to people, and it's going to be that you need to care for yourself. I totally endorse the idea of self-quarantining as much as possible. But if you don't want to do that, that's fine. Put on masks and you do things at your own risk. I mean, this is the world we live in these days. And then the reality is that's where we have to go with this, because the idea we would work at it on a united front was broken by both parties. The Republicans went out there and put the economy first. The Democrats went out there and put racial justice first, and neither of them cared about the virus. And this is part of the story of why I do things differently these days. That what we need to look at is the question of how we put people first. And I had a new listener who reached out to me, and this is what I wanted to talk about. He had asked me a very good question, and he was asking me, Tom, I listened to your last show, and for those of you who haven't listened, on Monday I went on a rather lengthy rant about everything that was wrong and all the bad things that were happening in America. And he said, you have a good vision. Can you give me 3 concrete ways in which I can move towards enacting it? And I took the challenge very seriously. I actually spent a couple days working on the question, and I came up with some stuff. So one of the things I wanted to talk about, and this will all seem very abstract and foundational, but bear with me. A lot of times where you start with your mindset, your psychology really prejudices where your outcomes go. So I want to start at that point. And my point that I want to make is that we don't ask the right questions. We approach our lives very pragmatically, right? We think we know a lot, and we think that it's a matter of just making the system work differently. But if there's one thing we should be learning in this time, we are seeing systems break all around us. The political system has been broken for a very long time, but that's getting revealed. I think we'll see the economic system begin to break down, as I told you throughout many episodes of the show, as finance has become decoupled from the actual economy of goods and services, where you have well over 40 million people probably unemployed, and you have another, what we added, 1.5 million to the rolls at this point. New shutdowns are going to mean more economic trauma, and the market will eventually take the hit. I heard a rumor that they're trying to artificially float the market until July because there are pandemic bonds related to that we're not aware of, where derivatives exist on this for certain criteria. I don't know everything, but I know weird things happen in high finance. It wouldn't surprise me, and I would very much expect, as we come into next week and we come into July, between the combination of unrest that is going to happen around July 4th, the economic breakdown that's coming into us, the different actions happening with China, amongst other countries around the world, and also not to forget the fact that we are going to also have, what was I going to say, that you have the virus itself is going to become more penetrating in destroying the summer tourist season for a lot of places. I think that we're going to see a very difficult July. And as we see that, we're going to be in a position where the instability is going to shake this country to its core. And so we have to decide, what are we about now in terms of a new system? And so the question I began asking right now, and I will come back to all of your questions, by the way, in as much as I can, because I can see them there. Let me go through my little monologue. I don't actually script these things. Dana will tell you. I tried one time when I was running for office to script a speech, and it was the worst speech you ever heard. It was canned. It was awful. So I don't do that, but I do have an idea where I want to go with this. And where I want to go is the first question I started to ask myself when I looked at questions is this good? And I know that's a question that's a little bit loaded, but let me ask it the right way. We do things because we think they're smart, or we think they're clever, or they're the way things have been done before, or they're different. We do them because of ideology, or we do them because of self-interest, but we rarely ask the question if something is good. And there's three answers to the question, right? The answer number one is yes, of course it's good, and B is no, it's terrible, and C is sometimes like, I don't really know. And that's fine. That's okay that we have those answers. But what I find happens over and over again is that we have a lot of policies where, if we're really honest with ourselves, we go out there and say, is this good? No, it's not good. It's terrible. And whether it's moral policies that see the damaging and hurting of people, deaths, I look at abortion that way, just one example, or whether it's an economic policy where we basically leave sick people or homeless vets or, people with mental illness to rot. We know these are bad policies. We know that they show a lack of regard for human life, and our conscience calls it out. And we might even say that, no, well, government shouldn't do this. This is someone else's problem. But we go through all of life saying that things are other people's problems. And my goal is not to get into an argument about what government should and shouldn't do, so much as it is to reorient people toward a simple question, which is, I was asked, what can we do to be better people to get towards the vision I had suggested? And one of the things I wanted to suggest is you can ask if things are good. And if things are good, you should endorse them, whether you endorse them, whatever method makes sense. And if things are bad, you should oppose them. And I want to talk about that for a second. There's a lot of things we agree to look the other way, I'll use the famous word. Tolerance is the word of the day, right? At least it was until we were having all these violent demonstrations. But what does it mean to tolerate something? It means to suffer it, right? It means to accept something is not ideal, that isn't good. And I think that's bad. And I think, honestly, it shows a lack of regard. The lie and the myth that we tell is that we tolerate things because we are being more thoughtful people. The truth is uglier. It's that we tolerate things we hate because we're too busy to be bothered with it. And I think people need to recognize that difference and recognize we are all each other's burdens. So that's the first point I wanted to make to the gentleman who asked the question of what we needed to do, which is we need to care about these issues. We need to go ahead and ask what's good and what's bad. The second thing we need to do is begin having conversations about that where we honestly express our opinion. So often people go along with the conventional wisdom because they don't want to fight about it. For instance, and I experienced this in my life, when I was the town manager of Jackman and I got fired for saying that I think it's fine for white people to have interest, they got mad at me like, you're not allowed to say that. I think it's fine for white people to have interest. I think it's fine for black people to have interest. I think it's fine for all sorts of people to have interest. I think that not having self-interest and pretending that some people are above others causes more conflict. I was talking to a very nice woman earlier today, and she comes from a far left perspective, and we had a totally respectful conversation. She asked me why I don't support critical race theory, and it's very simple, because if one side's the oppressor and the other side is the victim, then you create a moral imbalance where one person is good and one person is bad, and you don't want to have whole groups of people cast as bad guys. I don't want to cast that of the people who are out there protesting. I know a lot of them are good and misled. A number of them are truly wicked. Conversely, I don't want to say the government's good. Lord knows most of them, in my experience, tend to be toward the wicked side. And same within the church, outside of the church, all of these sort of things. But what I wanted to say to her was, you have to build a new center. So my second point is, as we ask each other what's good and what's evil, what we want and what we don't want, and those two questions should be one and the same, what we should do is shift the situation away from, is the market better? Is the state better? Is Republican better? Is Democrat better? Is black better? Is white better? And we should ask a different question altogether, which is, if things are good and bad, which are the ones that are good, and how do we get to those sort of outcomes, and what actually is true? Ask truth and ask those considerations. And it's okay that we disagree. We're going to disagree over a lot, and that's fine. Societies are built upon a whole lot of disagreements. But, and this is the important part, a couple key agreements that we all agree are good things. For instance, we probably agree it's a good thing that people can't stab each other just because they don't feel like it. There are some people who don't. That's what anarchism presupposes. But if you agree with those basic things, we can agree to agree. And there are some things we could say, no, that is so awful. For instance, the idea of someone raping a 3-year-old. I would imagine 99.9% of people would agree with that statement as being atrocious. So those are things we can do. And if we start having conversations at that level, and we can be honest and build a little bit of unity and be able to go ahead and draw that connectivity, then we can start having something cooking. Because rather than saying my side is right, your side is wrong, that's how it begins to change. And then once you've begun to understand and how to speak honestly that way, and be honest with yourself, cut through your own bullshit, that then you have the opportunity to speak to others and say, hey, okay, agree to agree what you can and say these things are good and these things are bad. And sometimes it will be confused, but I think you would be very pleasantly surprised by the amount of things you could agree upon, because we're reaching a point where the only ones who are going to save us are us. Big finance is robbing the country blind, and they are out there playing an enemy role in this game. The politicians are utterly oblivious, indifferent, or basically are milking this, okay? The media is basically going ahead screaming fire like they're Beavis watching someone take a toilet paper roll and make it into a flaming torch. That is a problem that's out there. And I think when we look at other groups, these people who are out there in the streets, not the protesters who come out who are concerned about criminal justice reform. We could absolutely talk about that. We should talk about that. But the people who are going down there, tearing down all of our history, and it's all our history, for good and for bad, these are people who only seek to destroy. And what are they? They're forces of chaos trying to deprive a world of order, because that's the only way they can make the thing they want. They want to create a throne of bones on a kingdom of ashes. And that this is really the problem that we have to deal with. So I see Richard writing that I'm one of the few that understands that the power in the country comes from fiat money. And what I did, and I worked very hard on this, and I will share it with you because I think this is interesting, and hopefully it will be interesting. Let me make sure it comes out okay so you can see it. Give me 1 second here because I want to share with you. I went ahead and I figured out what my values are and what I believe. And I would present these as the beginning point for a conversation and maybe a movement that can make a difference. So I shared a link with you so you can see it. I worked with this. I want to give some thanks to a couple people. Sheepdog, who's in here, who helped a little bit in conversations, and more than that, to my wife, Dana, who did an incredible job helping, listening, and having to hear me figure through this. I've often told you I have 4 core values, and this is what I did with the New Albion movement, but this is something different and broader. Reason, loyalty, grace, and nature. And so I put some values to this, and I said, what do we need? The artisan who creates, the sage who teaches, the steward who grows, and the knight who protects. And these are the groups of people in our society, to be honest with you, who have been disaffected and who were the ones who were the pillars of this. The soldiers, the first responders who were over there fighting against the forces of chaos that want to bring us down to the war of all against all. That isn't a win for us. reason, workers and innovators, working to end plunders by bankers and finance. Making interest off people is the most cynical way to live when you make fake money, get it for free, charge people interest on it, and live basically as a parasite off them. We have to understand that fiat money in the banking system works that way, and that the banks are one of the key enemies we need to fight, not the only ones. The forces unrest, bankers. Then the next one, grace. Clergy and scholars speak boldly to the deceptions of the media. The media lies to you by not telling you things, by telling you things that are false, by telling you half the story, and you deserve to know the truth, the whole truth, and nothing for it. We can't live in a country where you only hear certain voices or not others, where certain voices are valid and certain aren't. All voices are valid. All lives matter. All perspectives need to be considered and heard, which isn't to say they're all correct. We have to be able to use our reason to make judgments about that. But then that comes down to nature. We do live in a world with rules and with purpose. And as part of that, I put in there farmers fighting against politicians. Our framers were farmers who fought against a faraway tyrant and a despot, where they understood they just wanted to live their lives. And I honestly believe that's what 95% of Americans want. They want to live their lives in safety and security, but they're not allowed to because of a crazy, homicidal, genocidal elite that go out there, and they are not attached to us. They have declared war on the people. They have declared war on reality. They have declared war on, the value. They rob everyone through inflation and through taxes. They destroy order by putting police aside to allow rioters to destroy the cities. They have scholars that are paid millions of dollars to go out there and tell people that, that they should hate themselves. And they desecrate faith. I mean, they desecrate churches by teaching things that are totally abiblical. And they don't just target Christians either. Anyone of goodwill gets targeted. And against nature, have you ever seen a corporation that isn't willing to tear things apart? And this is not a left-right way of looking at the world. This is a sane way of looking at the world based on core values. And I don't know anyone who would argue reason, grace, nature, and loyalty are good. Would you prefer to live in a world of treason, of fantasy, artificiality, and malice? I mean, is that what we want? But those are the worlds we live in. And why is that? Well, one reason why is we orient our lives around what's not good. What do people care most about? Money. You live to pay your bills, or you lose your house, you lose your home, you lose your friends, money and status. But what are these things? These are conceits in the world of man that are based upon this idea of whatever gets along, whatever makes us famous, popular, rich, wealthy. And all of these things are it's a transformative relationship where instead of being subjects, people relating to one another, we make this intermediary object, and we turn each other into objects to be used for service for other things. And mind you, look, we live in a world where realistically we all have to do things we don't want to do it sometimes. And I'm not going to say that we're going to live in a world without labor, far from it. But labor can have purpose. When I'm laboring in my garden, I'm creating food. When an artisan creates a business, or a worker builds a product, they're building something. And yet, who do we labor for increasingly? More and more, we labor for people who have nothing but pieces of paper that they use to control us. And you know what? That's the modern day slavery. That's what we need to fight. That's why, the war I am arguing for, and it is a war, let's be very clear. It's a war against evil, where we understand evil begins, it's not fully encapsulated, but begins with banking and the idea of usurious transgenerational interests being used to control people, because they are making money out of thin air that we are killing each other and dying for. And until and unless we change how that fundamental relationship works, we will remain under thrall of their evil spell. So I put this thing together, so if you're looking at it with all these different concepts in it, and at the center of it is what leadership looks like, and that's where justice happens. Justice is not about equality, it's about equity. Equality is trying to force people to be the same. Equity is about saying there's an equality of opportunity. You lead following the values of your people, and you stop having elites who are disconnected. You need leadership amongst people like yourselves, people like myself, hopefully on a good day, that encompasses these values, and that we fight for these. And we fight for each other. And it's not about going out there and having a violent revolution. I do think it may come to that one day. I can't lie to you about that. But it's about a separation where you rebuild yourself. And let me say this as a man of faith, that the way I look at the world is fundamentally different than most people. Most people look at the world where they say, what is the big interest that I can do to succeed, to make my life better, or my wife's, or my family's, or all that? And I don't really look at it that way. I actually, at this point, I'm advanced enough, or devout enough, who knows if it's advanced, I'm devout enough in my faith where I ask the question, how do I serve this idea of a good that's greater than myself, that gives meaning to life, where if we go into humanity or humanism being the highest of all moralities, we end up with only the virtue of selfishness, where we're all fighting against each other of self-interest. And this, like Thomas Hobbes wrote, we end up with this war of all against all, where all we hope for is an awful leviathan to control us, and that we end up in a position where we don't care about one another because all we are utilitarians looking to use one another and not get ourselves into too much trouble. And it's a cynical world. It's a detached world. It's a world where we stare at screens hoping to reach people instead of knowing how to have a conversation with one another. And I will tell you, it's a fake world. That if you go out there and you're willing to speak truth, you can cut through so many lines and achieve so much goodwill, and you really do find who is lost and who could be saved. And the good news is that there's a lot of people who can be saved because they can believe in something again, but it's only if you orient yourself toward the good. And I admit your idea of good will not match mine exactly. I posit, and one day I'll go into it in more detail, a Christian version of that, where you have this idea of the radical message of the Gospels, that you should care for and love for one another. Even people who are non-Christian generally tend to like that message, as opposed to submission or dominion under law. The idea that faith, grace, and fellowship can actually bring people together are powerful, are liberating, and something we can achieve. I mean, about an hour and a half ago, actually, I was in our Telegram group, which, by the way, I will invite you to join, t.me/coronavirus central. And I was in geopolitics and some of the side groups we have. And we were talking about this, and we had some far lefties and far righties saying they were calling out each other on their hypocrisies and calling out their own. And, it's true. The right cares about you until you're born, and then they don't give a damn about you. Or the left, goes out there and says they care about justice, but only for the groups they like. And we got through and we really cut to the bone of things. And when we got to the bottom, we felt liberated for shedding our lies from ourselves and found that the truths at the center, things that we could stand together on, were not only powerful enough to unite us, but they actually represented a total divergence from the system we have, where basically to defend lesser truths, we end up supporting greater lies. And that's one of the things we have to get away from. The lie that DC serves us must be, revoked. The idea that Hollywood media is healthy in any way, shape, or form, it teaches desperation and anger. Just go through the Netflix shows at any point. When was the last time you saw a show that made you feel good about yourself or affirmed anything? It just doesn't happen. Or, the amount of money. I mean, what were we talking about? $10 trillion that was basically robbed through these loan obligations. And I guarantee you more bailouts are coming because big business is monopolizing and taking out small business. Why? A few people at the top are doing a hostile takeover of our civilization, and they literally are just waiting to put robots in to replace us. I'm not even kidding. Dana might share the really scary. It's a CGI video, but if you want to be scared to death of what your future looks like of robots chasing humans, you should see this. And how do we know that? Well, look how they take care of the land. Look how they take care of the people. They leave us to rot. They don't care about anything other than making parks for themselves. They don't actually try to make things better for people. And that is the politician class, who is owned lock, stock, and barrel on both and all sides, for the most part, by the financiers. And that's what we're having. And so what do? They're happy to put rioters out there to loot. And some of them end up being the useful idiots, and some of them end up being the misguided idealists. But we all end up having to fight one another while they sit there and laugh at us while they pull the puppet string. So I'm not doing that anymore. And I'm going to try to the very best of my ability, without surrendering the values I believe in, to speak to people about why we need to come to a new consensus and how we need to work very quickly to do that. And that we need to separate ourselves from that which is evil. And I know that's a lot to ask, but I'm telling you, we're going to be forced to do it anyway. Better we do it on our terms and united in numbers as we do it. So that's what I'm looking at. And I will tell you even furthermore, we have begun talking about how to do this in different areas. We even talked about dividing the U.S. up into 7 different regions to work on this. I've worked very, very heavily on the stuff in the Northeast, but I've talked to people in what I would call Middle Appalachia, in the Southeast, in the Midwest, Texas and those areas, the Pacific Coast, the Mountain West, as well as our friends in Canada West and Canada East, which I understand Canada is a little more complicated than that. But you guys have your own issues. Nonetheless, we are all in it together because Western civilization itself is at risk, which would see the death of Christianity. It would see the death of liberty, and it would see us diminished in a world that will look like authoritarian China. And I don't think any of us want that. And trying to reform on the fly when your whole system is structured against the people is very difficult. Yet, even if we fail, how much better will we be for the effort of trying? So that is what I've been working on. And, if you have questions, we can go into them. There'll be a lot more in the days ahead. I'm actually working to put pamphlets together, but figuring out how to make very complex issues simple is hard. There's a reason I write books that have hundreds of pages. Like Incoming over there is like 400 or 500 pages, where I got to cover a lot of ideas and do the stream of consciousness thing. And to be honest with you, I like writing books 1,000 times better than I like making videos. Always have done it, but this is the feed of the time. And so I'm doing the very best I can to reach out to people before I get shut down and to reach and connect with people across all different types. And look, I will accept the rebukes. There have been times I have been a nasty son of a bitch, and there will be times I'll do it again because I'll have to do it because of the fights that are going to be picked. And I'm never going to be someone who stands against something I think is wrong. But bridges are being made. Ladders are being made and ropes are being tossed down to help people. And if you're someone who's serious about trying to do something good and we can work together, I'm with you. And I'm willing to compromise on certain things so long as it doesn't hurt people or damage lives. Because I think those are things there's bridges I'm not willing to cross. And I think you have to know that about yourself, and not asking people to stand up against ultimate goods that they believe in. At some point, you end up at the end of this thing where we're going to be staring across a battlefield. I absolutely believe it. Within 6 to 12 months, in whatever form of combat, whether it be ideological or whether it be mortal, we are going to be standing where one side's going to see a force of good versus the other side as a force of evil as seen by their opponent. And if that's the fight that's coming, and I do not believe we will escape that fight, I want to stand up for the greatest good I can and pray for the Lord to offer deliverance to our people, because ultimately, in a battle between good and evil, good is what you have to bet on, because even if you die, that's the only way you can really live. And I would never want to be the force for evil, whatever's said about me or whatever's out there. And that's the world we're living in. It's a hard, difficult world. It's not a world of comfort or ease. It's a world of sacrifice. And yet that's going to come. And I will tell you why, because the virus is going to wreck what's left of the economy. The international system is breaking down. Scarcity will become an issue, and people will regress to their worst nature unless they have some deep moral code and meaningful, deep connection about how to avoid that. So to the gentleman who asked the question, what were my 3 points that I wanted to make? Well, you have to learn what is good. You have to speak about what is good and gather people together on that basis. That's the only way you can live this life, not just in politics, but as actually being a decent human being. Otherwise, you're just going to be a rotten son of a bitch, and that's your right to do that. But I will tell you, it's a very sad way to go and a loss of a lot of opportunity. So that's my soliloquy for today. Hopefully, you all find it useful, and we will go ahead and go forward into this. So I will go through that and I will talk about more. So hello to everyone who's here. Welcome. I didn't even look at the video screen while I was doing that. I'm just talking into a camera, which, by the way, if you've never done this before, I know we got some streamers in here who can attest to this. It's the weirdest thing to do these things where you're just talking into a camera, but at least I'm in a comfort zone. We're here in the room. We got the old pines and lines behind us, my favorite band era. I don't care how much trouble I get into. I'm not abandoning that flag. I bled for that flag, and I'm not even joking. But we got all the books around here. I've been reading like crazy, at least trying to. And one other thing I want to suggest, and let me know if you'd be interested, is I'm thinking about doing at least a monthly, maybe a bi-weekly book club. And I mean that with respect to, I will pick a book, or you guys may occasionally, maybe we'll split it. I'll pick one book a week. Or one book a month. You guys can pick one book, and we will read them together to gain greater understanding. We'll talk about them. We'll review things that are out there. Just don't ask me if we read White Fragility, because I'm going to burn that bastard. But anything else, I would be happy to. And I can introduce you to some really interesting literature in that way, and it will force me to read things I want to read, because I have to say, one of the hardest things for me at this point in life is to actually read a full book, just because my mind goes so many different places, and I spend a lot of time on the phone. I actually spent an hour last night talking to a family from Middle America that's moving to Maine because they don't feel like it's safe, and I was giving them a lot of advice and insights that I would say to anyone. One other piece of advice I wanted to give before I answer your questions is, now is a very good time to get to a place where you feel like you belong. Or if you live in a place where you don't feel like you belong, you need to be moving. And I realize that's a major hardship. It's less than the hardship you will deal with later. If I'm wrong, at least you'll be in a place you think you'd like more. If I'm right, it may very well save your life. So I'm just telling you that. Take it how you will. Busy Needle, good to see you. Hello from Alabama, where we are in a spike. The hospital's near capacity, and I get looked at like an idiot in public because I'm masked, man. I don't feel bad about it. I still wear my mask. And I tell you something crazy about that. Talk about looking like an idiot in public. I live in Greenville, Maine, population 1,600 people. 1 in every 8 plates I've seen are from out of our state. I've seen, and you don't usually see this. We are a little bit of a touristy town, but our hotels are still theoretically shut down to out-of-state residents. I'll tell you some of the states I've seen up here lately: Alaska, Montana, Idaho, Georgia, Florida, Delaware, a ton of New York, ton of Massachusetts, New Jersey, Virginia. I saw Minnesota come through here. These are not states you see here. We get a lot of people from New Hampshire and Vermont and a lot of people from Mass, a couple New Yorkers, but we've been getting people from far afield, and I've seen more Maine temporary plates than I've ever seen in my life before, and I've been up here quite a few years. So I think people are moving. They're voting with their feet, and I don't think it's a bad idea to do that if you are in a place where you feel like things aren't handled well. Now, I will say with respect to the virus, I think it's going to be a problem everywhere, and it's going to go back and forth. And I will tell you, I've had a little bit of a crisis with the virus lately because I've had to question so many of the sources I looked at. I don't know what to tell you is true anymore, other than that I can look at how the virus is being used, and it's being used to suppress people. It's being used in ways that are very selective in their enforcement, and that will only ultimately serve to shake down the people's ability to work together. I continue to support the idea of safety in an unknown situation, and that we should get support from the government to survive, even as I recognize that debt is ultimately unsustainable. But to be honest with you, the dollar is fake anyway, and if they're going to give $10 trillion to the businesses, I would argue that every person should be treated at least as generously as a corporation. And ultimately, I am going to continue and advance that war against them. And I know I'm going to be attacked. I know I'm going to be flamed, and I'm going to be, derided, and I'm going to deal with a lot of scorn, and they're going to say horrible things about me, which they always do. And, yeah, I talk to everybody. I own that. That's fine. I mean, actually, you'd be surprised. Some of the proudest things I've done in my life is, and this is personal, but I do want to share it. I talk to a lot of people who are reckoned amongst the worst people in America, and have actually brought them to the faith and helped them become better people. And I'm grateful for doing service like that because, I don't believe people are beyond redemption. At the point at which we believe that, then all that's left is fight one another. And I just don't want to, I don't want to be that person. I could be that person. I'd be terrible at, no, I would be very good at it, but I would be a terror to behold. And I don't want to be that person. And I don't think any of you do too. So we'll see what happens, but let's continue. But don't feel bad for wearing a mask. Don't feel bad for looking your self-interest. And another thing, don't care what people think about you. I mean, if people attack you in ignorance, don't let that change how they look at you. Don't change who you are because of the superficial ways in which people view one another. Find your moral core and build that out. Wear it like a shield. The Bible talks about this, the armor of God. When you have faith and you're doing the right thing, you can do that. You need to kindle something within you, a fire that keeps you lit. All right, Alexa, good to see you. Brian, glad you're here. Bradford, welcome to the show. Long-time listener, at least it seems a long time ago since this Coronavirus Central days on Spotify. 3 months or 3 years ago. More like 3 decades, man. I used to have hair, right? I'm just kidding. But yeah, no, Spotify shut us down, and I tell you why. There's some little journalist who goes around as a freelancer in Boston who likes to cause problems. And I happened to find out about this person. And as usual, my intelligence network's pretty good, but that's fine. They can shut down the truth. They're only hurting themselves. And I just go ahead and put truth out there. I mean, people can attack me, but I can defend anything I say because I just say things that are true. And not that I'm the patron saint of perfection, but I go out there and I tell you things that are true. And if they're wrong and you prove me wrong, I admit it. There's nothing in it other than that. We're trying to learn and support one another. Sarah, good to see you. Joseph, glad you're here. I'll agree. Everyone should water their gardens. So, see, Sarah asked me, they surprised California didn't roll back any reopenings yet. Yeah, they can't. I mean, look, the economies are broken and unemployment's about to go bankrupt. And this is the problem. They're not going to do it. They're going to roll through this. They're not going to be able to stay shut down for a lot of different reasons. And you need to deal with that reality. And it's a difficult reality, I'll admit. And you have to learn as you go through this process to value different threats. You can't focus all on one threat. For instance, you can't, how should I put it? you can't worry about just drowning if you're in a room filling up with water, if there's electrical lines in it. You have to worry about getting shocked too. And you have to constantly reassess your threats. And sometimes you do have to face situations that are very difficult. And, unless you can prepare totally to be apart from things, you're stuck. And even then, I will tell you, I listen to so many shows about bigger threats down the horizon. This is all part of a global plot to remake how humanity works. That's a big statement, and I know there's a lot in it, and it's going to be cryptic, but suffice it to say, in the super short version of it, the few people who have a lot of power, having consolidated that power, find people to be a liability. And so you will see them take actions that lead to mass death and set everyone to blame everyone else except the people who are really responsible, those who actually control who decisions are made. And if you look at you can follow the money trails pretty reliably to see who holds the puppet strings. All right, let me take a little drink of water here. I will say the one thing about doing fewer shows is it makes it a lot easier for me not have to have my throat be so dry and difficult. And I am trying to do a Wednesday, mostly virus-oriented show. I got to tell you, it's really hard. I get so angry at some of the things I read happening in the media, and I have so much distrust of what I'm reading. I don't trust myself to tell you that story very well. Everything I want to tell you that I at least believe to be true. And that crisis of what is true is really one that I think a lot of us struggle with. At least, hopefully they do. We'll see. Let's see. Nobody will listen to any new lockdown orders. Isn't that right, Joseph? That's absolutely true. And people can't comply. I mean, look, people are restless, and I get that. That's it. But you should wear a mask. I think that's it. I have family who think it's a hoax. The interesting thing about that, David, I wanna talk about that for a second, is because Dana and I were talking about that just this evening, because she was asking me what I thought in a reassessment of this. And what I said to her was, I think people who think this is a hoax fail to understand the depravity of those who would actually do something like this. If this was man-made, which I believe, and if it was intentionally released, which I actually privately also believe, I've been trying to discern what the purpose for this was based upon the outcomes that were managed by a lot of actors that should not be able to independently figure things out, but that seem to be working from a script. And what I was forced to conclude is that this was a destabilizing weapon designed to cripple and maim people, and that it was an effort to destroy people, but set them in a position where they would destroy one another. It was part of a controlled demolition, where the goal wasn't to incinerate the building, but to lock out certain key structures in the ability of our society to exist. Now, do I think China did that to destabilize the US? Probably. But do I think they also did that because there was help from institutions and people within our country who want to see that happen? I think that's very possible. And, this gain of function research that was out there was a terrible thing. And it goes back actually to the point I made at the beginning of the show, which is you should ask if something is good. And if you ask the question if it's good to make a virus that if escaped a lab could kill hundreds of thousands of people and hurt millions of them, the answer would be no, it isn't. But we don't have wisdom, we have intellect, and we don't know the difference, which is why you need more grace and a couple sages running around to say, hey, maybe you shouldn't be doing this. But the people who are in charge, they don't have that perspective because they don't even view us as people. They view us as remainders to be discarded. And when you look at how they treat us, I'm basing my judgment based upon how they look at us, that we are left to fight one another, we're left to rot. And, even for the people who are marching, all right, it's not my thing, but I get that they're mad about that. And they're not wrong about the fact that the system is against them. They just don't understand who the system is. The system isn't a group of people at the bottom fighting other people at the bottom. It's not gladiators in the pit. It's, Optimus sitting there at the top looking and laughing down on the little plebeians. And that is the world we live in, and that they control us through 100 different ways, and they control our very thoughts through the media that exists, like social media, where it's basically it's a gaggle of angry people attacking one another, all trying to reinforce the same opinion more aggressively. It's not making us better people, and you got to make yourself a better person. If you're not better, you can't win and you can't escape, and that's all you got to do, and that's all we can do. But if you act better, you can find better people, like I do with this podcast and this show, and with you guys who connect with one another through the community we've built, which is a remarkable thing, and through efforts that are coming from that, or some of the work I've done over the years, and I'm sure you individually do. I don't know about it, and I don't need to know about it. I just know that you should do it, and it starts with your own family, because as David said, it's not a good time for family division. So I think that that's absolutely the case it is. And you know what? See if you can find a point of concordance when you can't talk to people. Get beyond politics, get beyond the sort of basic stuff, and get to the fundamentals. And then once you look at the fundamentals, the question you can always ask is, does this meet your expectations? And when you both agree to say no, that's when a real conversation that can lead to somewhere productive can begin. You break the dialectic by resolving differences. And we are never encouraged to resolve our difference. We're encouraged to dominate and defeat one another. And that's fine. And we can go bash each other with sticks all day long. And it may come to that. And if it does, it does. But eventually, if stability is ever going to be recovered and we're going to have a civilization worth speaking of, we're going to have to get to the point where we agree on some things. And I think that's a good point to get to. Let's see. I hope your uncle's okay, Sarah, by the way. I should get a Casio watch, right? $3, Del Griffith. Bonus points if you recognize that. You're old enough, Eki, where you should get that reference, but a lot of the kids won't. For those who don't, the movie Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, John Candy and Steve Martin, absolutely hilarious. Great classic 1980s John Hughes movie. So maybe we'll have a little bit of lightness in this, too. It's a Friday show. Some silly questions would be welcome. Lord knows I hate you guys with heavy stuff all the time. The watch doubles as the mace. There we go. Low death rates is a net positive. And you do have to care for those who need it. That's absolutely true. What do I expect they will do with the unemployment benefits? I expect they will reduce them, the federal amount of them, probably maybe to 300-400 as a compromise. But I mean, it's sort of interesting, right? Because the Republicans got to be thinking they're screwed going into November right now. But on the other hand, what do they want to do? Do they want to go ahead and make more people mad? But they're afraid of what their own base would support. And a lot of the business people, I will say, who are really unhappy that cheap labor supply is dragging up, are probably going to push very hard against them. I don't know what they're going to do. I do think that there might be enough Republican defectors in the Senate to join the House, and I think Trump would sign whatever bill passed through with the most generous benefits, because why wouldn't he? I mean, it's all funny money anyways. When you're playing Monopoly, all you got to do is ask the banker for permission. But will they do that? I don't know. I think it really depends how it goes the next couple weeks. The benefits expire, if I remember right, July 31st. I think if we have another really bad week, and I think if Florida and Texas stay shut down, which are heavy red states, that you might see the extension of those benefits happen. But to what end is going to be the question that will happen. And honestly, whatever happens, there's going to be two schools of thought. Thought number one, the Democrats will probably want to extend it, I would imagine, till about September, because they would love to have it be a campaign issue to be fighting over in October and say Republicans don't want to pay for you. The Republicans, by contrast, even though it's contradictory to what you would think, would probably be smarter to extend it into December, past the election, so that way, if they did anything, they would be free from those consequences. Remember, it is a political year, and we do have an election. How weird is that, right? 130 days or so out from that, and I don't even know what's going on with any of that. I don't think it really even matters, and that's the funny thing. I mean, the question is, are we even going to have an election? And I don't even ask that in a sort of totalitarian, Trumpian sense, because it's not about that. It's just about the fact that the country's kind of struggling to hold together right now, and we have a leadership vacuum, and that's what we have to do. And the answer to that isn't like one inspirational leader. I mean, that's too much to ask for people. It's leadership within your community, and when you find that, what I think we're going to find is that our system is bad, and that we're going to have to begin separating from what doesn't work in the center, which is bought, and that's going to be hard, and that's going to lead to a place where some very difficult decisions will probably be necessary sooner rather than later. If things go bad, we might survive, but if things just jumble along, will we continue to allow graft and corruption to go ahead and own this? And I will say, I mean, I'm in a position where I can't accept either candidate winning. I don't know how many of you feel the same way, but it's really a hard spot. Gina, glad to see you. Thank you for coming in tonight. I appreciate that. Welcome to the show. I hope you like it. So yeah, just for people who don't know, I do the show at this point, although I always reserve the right to change it, Monday and Friday at 7:05 p.m. And by 7:05, I usually mean between 7:10 and 7:15. It's not my fault. I'm just usually rushing to take care of turtles and plants and stuff. But I do the best I can. But thank you. Richard writes, you are one of the few that understands all the power comes from fiat money. The ability to print unlimited sums of money and outspend anyone is the source of all power. Not only is Richard right, but one of the things you need to recognize is that other countries are trying to destroy America's ability to do that, because that is the means by which America is able to do a lot of things in the world. That we are allowed to be the grand conjurers of the economic fiction of the world. And a lot of countries would want to see that change. And that's why you shouldn't be surprised when so-called allies end up being enemies. And we're really going to find a strange shuffling of geopolitical alliances. I will make the prediction, I've said it before, but it's worth repeating, that you will see a new Germany, China, Russia axis probably form against America and its close friends, who are going to be in the Anglosphere, India, and probably Japan. And the rest of the world is kind of up for stakes right now. We'll see what happens. But if America ends up falling, it will be a real problem. And for the Western Hemisphere specifically, I think it means we need to be able to work together, whatever our disagreements are. If we stay together as one entity, make larger entities separate into micro entities. I have a map I drew up of the Northeast where we took all our states and I divided it into 31 new states, from states. Like I made New York into 8 different states. And I had this really strong idea that we were going to take every state and make sure no state had more than 5 million people, so that people could actually be represented as part of a larger reform. But whatever happens, we need to recognize we don't live in a vacuum. The world has an externality that's just waiting to jump on us. And there's a lot of people who are rightfully mad at America for what our government has done, not necessarily what our people have done. So I wouldn't expect a lot of friends. Usually when people are on the way down, take it from someone who's been ahead, been kicked out of office before, that literally people don't look to help you when your chin is bouncing off the rungs of the ladder on the way down. Brian says, I don't think big finance hasn't chosen a side. I don't, Brian. I think big finance controls both sides, to be honest with you, in this battle. I think that they use the left versus the right paradigm in a way where they can build a new center where what they're going to do is they're going to eventually suppress the right, purge the left, and offer stability with wealth to most people who, after so much instability, will actually be willing to accept whatever authoritarian regime they want to offer, and they'll be glad to give up their liberty for comforts. You know, they do studies about this. I was reading about a study the DOD did that literally only 3% of people actually care about liberty as a concept. 7% of people might be convinced to get off their couch. 90% of people want to know where their tendies are, chicken tenders. So most people are going to go along with things, and that's just the nature of how people are constructed. And so a very few people are going to have to take a lot of responsibility and terrible risks if we're not going to regress as a species. That's a long bet, and it makes it even more important why you have to call upon literally divine providence to protect you from fighting such an evil system. But yet, the universe has a funny quirk to it, in my experience, which is that it chooses intelligence and decency in spite of the fact that entropy should see us all become slugs. So you always got to hope for that little thumb on the end of it, and that's something that has happened over and over again in history. And as a Christian, I think that's absolutely true. So let's see. The Gina writes, I'd like you to suggest to follow Angry American on Facebook and the Wood Power Report. I'm not familiar with those, but I will have to check them out. Thank you for that. Fiat money is immoral. I agree with that. And it does create, it requires, well, this is actually, let's go through his point, because Richard makes a good point. It requires no work, no cost to create, right? So literally what it does is it takes possession of other things. Usury is the term. It uses people, right? Enables those who create money at will to buy, sell everyone who tolls for the same piece of paper. I always tell people it's an enchantment. It's dark magic. And I really believe that what it does is it makes us see one another as objects. We don't see each other as people anymore. We see each other as tools. And if you look at people as someone to be used, don't be surprised when they use you in turn. And it's fake. It's not like, and I know people say, well, you know, you have to have money to have an economy. And sure, you need a means of exchange, no doubt about it. And you need a store of value. I mean, until we can design something better, we could get into that conversation. But let's say money's been around a very long time, but it's the love of money that's the root of evil. And the idea that you're going to create everything. You know, we love numbers. We love statistics. We love to quantify things. Instead, what I'm suggesting to you in the simplest terms is you need to look at things qualitatively. And if you start to look at it that way, you begin to put things in different orientations. For instance, if I said, hey, someone was going to offer you $500,000 to sell your son to them, And then you'd be like, well, if you look at it from a moral perspective, oh, I can never sell something I love. But from an economic perspective, you'd be like, well, I could afford to have 4 kids and I could trade them off. But you just don't do that. And that's the thing. We don't live in a world where there are people who just don't do that. And the people who run the system are people who will literally do anything, because ultimately they see man as a fallen creature who's there to degrade and to be destroyed. And the worse you act, the more they enjoy it, the more they encourage you, the more they incentivize you, because in those sort of actions, you create the very situation whereby they can control people. Because when you are controlled by your vices, you become an island unto yourself. And that's a terrible place to be for anyone, because it's a very lonely place. And as Murray would say if he's here, we don't want to be lonely. All right, automation is coming, by the way, and I'm glad Joseph mentioned that. One of the things that you should know is that they were looking, before all this COVID broke out, that automation was going to destroy as much as 40% of the job supply. So what happens when you have economic breakdowns and a lot of jobs being lost is that wars tend to happen as people in leadership positions of governments, A, seek for ways to diffuse the unrest, and B, look for ways to remove debts and surplus population. So expect war to be coming, and expect it to be an ugly war that kills a lot of people. I know that's a very ugly thing, but if you look at the situation honestly that happened from the Great Depression in 29, the sort of push toward more government roles in life in the 30s, the New Deal, and ultimately World War II, which started in 1939, there was a cycle that has been repeated and replicated over and over again, where you make government bigger, stronger, more authorities, and then you fight to go ahead and make the remainder go away. And what is the remainder? It's the people who don't belong in the new system. So if you are a dissident, which, by the way, you are by virtue of listening to this podcast, sorry I didn't put a disclaimer out there about that, you will find that this is the sort of thing you have to deal with. And we live in a world where you don't have to be taken to a camp to be killed. You just have to be put in a position where you're going to fail and where the situation will take most of us out. And that could happen. And I know that sounds really harsh and really awful, but the writing's out there. You can find it. You don't have to look very hard. Go read a report from Iron Mountain or go read Carol Quigley, like I'm going to be reading here in the next week. It's ugly. And yet, that is the way of the world, you know? Steve asked, all right, let me continue this here. So 1 second here. I lost where the thing's at, so I will find it. And thank you all for spending a Friday night with me. Hopefully you're enjoying it. You know, I'm trying to be nice and level-headed, not get too messed up today. We're just having some water and taking it easy and trying to recover, because I'm actually working pretty hard in the mornings. I do all my thinking and writing in the morning, and then I try to relax in the evening, spend time with the missus. So that is something I work on. Am I Catholic, Tom? Steve, I am not Catholic. I have a lot of problems with Pope Francis. I'm not going to get into them out of respect for my Catholic friends, but I am a Christian. Some people would say I'm evangelical. I'm just more interested in understanding Christ and understanding the message of the Bible and seeking communion with the Holy Spirit. So that's what I work on. I suppose you would say the church I go to is of a flavor of evangelicalism, but I look at myself more ecumenically in that context of it. I tend to think that salvation, I affirm the 3 creeds, but I would say that salvation for me is rooted more in following the lessons of Jesus. And I find that there are problems in every church. I mean, the corruption of the Catholic Church is very well known. The corruption of the evangelical church and the prosperity gospel, where, you know, we've basically reduced God to someone who basically does parlor tricks for us, or the social gospel where we ignore the Bible, is just as bad. And I'll be honest, maybe it's because I'm a Slav, I kind of like the Orthodox Church, but we'll see. I'm sure they have problems too, and I'm just not familiar enough to admit to them. But that's my own belief. That's what I attest to. So thank you for that question. And, you know, if you're ever curious, we can talk. Very happy to talk about theology off air. Locked out of telly. Around here, I keep seeing large fields of solar panels popping up. I believe that's true. You know, I was actually baptized Catholic. I mean, I wasn't really raised Catholic. Good point by Gandalf, but I was baptized Catholic. My parents were not religious at all. My dad was a lapsed Catholic, and so was my mother, and my mother was my dad's second wife, and the church didn't renounce the first wedding, even though she had cheated on him. It was a mess. So suffice it to say, I didn't go to church very much as a kid, and I was always sort of nominally Christian, but I didn't really understand it. I didn't get really deep into faith until my 30s. And then I realized, well, there has to be a good in the world. And do you want it to be the good of mankind, or the good of just yourself? Or do you want to see something bigger? And I always tell people something that's sort of difficult to understand, but I think it's really important, because there's a lot of pantheism out there, and I'm not a pantheist, that God is the epitome by definition of all things. So God is universally general. That's true. He is the God of all people, but God is also universally specific. God, and I understand there's a paradox there. And yet, when you look at the different faiths of the world and you ask which one is affirming, which one says life has meaning, which one has purpose, not the negation of an Eastern religion or not the submission that's forced under other religions, I really find that Christianity answers that message. And that's why I believe it is the one true faith and why I honor it and accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. And I think it has made me a better person. And I will say there's no faith more persecuted in the world today than Christianity. And knowing that the elites hate more. And I would ask people to look, why should they hate a faith that wants to help people, except if they are evil? And remember, evil understands that good exists. I think one of the big problems about good is that, and I think this is actually the heart of the crisis in a broader sense, beyond Christianity, that we have been tricked into believing good and evil are relative. Evil doesn't believe that. It knows better than that. But good, because it is good, doubts itself, because it has questions, because it has tolerance and grace and humanity and all those things. So ultimately, good has to remember that good cannot afford to do nothing, and good has to reroot itself in fundamentals so it can go out there and fight evil. Because if you have no one fighting evil, what do you end up with? Looks a lot like America in 2020, doesn't it? And it can't be just your good, because if it's just your good, what ends up happening, honestly, is you can never agree, and then you end up with the war of all against all. You got to find some bigger things to agree upon it. I would submit to you that we are in a position where we have seen through practice that our own goods do not meet that. And some people will disagree with that, and that's fine. I respect that. That is your right to have that opinion. I very much hold differently. And when you look at the flow of Western history and stability and problems, you could actually, I think, see compelling evidence that when we were a more devout people, we were a better connected and more happy people. And if there were mistakes made, we can honor those and try to correct those and become better people. We don't have to paper over what happened before to go ahead and say there's a lot of good things getting destroyed right now, because a time of iconoclasm that breaks everything is really going to break people too. And if we're fine with that, fine. I mean, that's where it's at. But I think we should be very careful about that road. It is sad to see so many young people involved with this. I agree with that, young women and men alike. And you shouldn't drift from your values, you know. And I would tell you, I think, yeah, people are not as woke as they think. That's absolutely true. Regina, good to see you here. A great book by Ecke, Fourth Generation Warfare by Bill Lind. Good guy, absolutely. I will tell you, William Lind thinks our situation is like, what do you say, 18th century Spain. So if you want to take his idea of it, I actually had a conversation with the man once. This was a while back at an event, but very interesting guy. Let's see here. Just bought a house on an island. Good for you. Good to hear you, Gina. Congratulations on that. I hope a tidal wave doesn't. I'm just kidding. I was talking to a family from Middle America. No, so Eric, that's a great question. Why was I talking to them? They reached out to me, actually. I'm somewhat known up here in Maine for being out there, and they had some questions about things that were happening up here. So I don't want to identify who they are or where they're from in more detail, because they have the right to privacy. And one of the reasons they're moving up here, if they do so, is because they don't want to be bothered. They've been politically harassed very heavily. So in honor of that. But am I running for office, Eric? I am not running for office ever again. I'm sure my wife will be glad to hear that. But I don't believe in the political process, and I don't believe in democracy. And to explain why, just real simply, pluralism has led to division of war of all against all. I think what we need to do is come to commonality on values and go ahead and have leadership that exists to realize those values, not to fight to change them, and then allow people to vote for things at their local level in a system where there's a few powers strongly expressed at the top, as was intended in the original Constitution, and most everything else, including the money, this is the important part, is left to the local level. And I'd say that's true not just for government, but also for business. If it was up to me, I would have a tax code where you would tax the hell out of big businesses, not based on profits, but based on revenues, so that you'd have a world of small businesses so everyone could get a piece of the pie, and you could have businesses that are small and accountable to your community. Would you have less? Yes, you would, but you would have more people have a piece of the pie. You'd have more people involved in the process, and I suspect you'd have a higher quality of life. And this comes down to a question of quality versus quantity. You know, there's a book out there, and I think the left has some good arguments on this. You can't eat GDP. It's absolutely true. What good does it do when we make a whole bunch of money when none of us have it, right? But that's money, you know. Glad I'm moving to an extremely white suburb despite being in a red state. A lot of people are doing things like that, Steve. You are not alone. Retaking state capitals might be a good idea. I do think in the future that one thing we may be looking at is people will be separating out by state. I think that depending on what happens in the days ahead, I don't want to make too many predictions on it, but I actually think on all sides, I would actually see it as sort of a hopeful vision if you saw left and right both agree to separate, maybe from each other and from the central system, or come up with something. But DC is against all of us. It's against you if you're a communist, if you're against you if you're a fascist, if you're a Democrat, if you're a Republican, if you're conservative, if you're liberal. They're just for themselves. I mean, it's hypocrisy and nepotism. That's all it is. And I'm not endorsing any particular philosophy. I mean, you want my opinions, go read my books. But if you have a question, I'll let you know what I think. But I think that ultimately what we have is just plain and simple theft and graft. It's pretty ugly. Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackay may be the perfect book. It might be. Let's see. Biggins asks, what makes me think Maine will last in the Northeast during the upcoming race war? All it takes is a couple refugee programs, and Maine is the new Minnesota. I will say this. I think Maine has a very strong sense of itself, with a couple towns having certain issues, Lewiston foremost amongst them. But I think people here will rally. And honestly, I do think that if things held together for 20 years, Maine would be in a lot of trouble. But I think that things being what they are, and the inflows of people as opposed to outflows, that this state will ultimately be fine in spite of really pathetic leadership. Janet Mills is terrible. Susan Collins is equally terrible. We really have subpar leadership up here, but that's fine. Want a place who is militant for war at all times, like common culture and belief. Last better, Utah. Yeah, Utah will be all right. The Mormons will take care of their own. And so why? I mean, you look at a state with good order, right? They might be a little funny to some of us, and Lord knows I don't agree with their beliefs, but the Mormons take care of their own, and they have, in a lot of ways, an exemplary and clean culture. There's something that could be learned there, to be very clear. So let's see. Thank God for the rain. Let's see. I drank with two hands. Yeah, I did. Well, these are heavy, these mason jars, But I could do it one-handed if you want. Left or right-handed. Send 50% of the government workers home to save some money from the budget. You could do that, but honestly, I don't get, a lot of people on left and right argue about how money's spent. I don't really get into it so much because I think about how money's made. I mean, the truth is the Fed is robbing you more than the Democrats and Republicans combined. They just provide cover, and then we fight over who's arguing us, or who's robbing us. Is it the left with their social policies? Is it the right with their corporate welfare? They're all robbing us. Or we might fight against an inner city family on welfare, or let's see, a tax break for a small business. But we're fighting over pennies when you're having literally $100 bills being ripped off by comparison, right from the printer at the highest level. So if you're against theft and graft, I'm with you, but let's go after the people who are really seriously doing it. Can't we come together and say, hey, I think if we went ahead and stopped them from robbing us, we could literally give money to every single cause you wanted and have plenty there to spare. But we don't do that. Why? Because we don't understand how money works. So that's one of the reasons why I look at it differently. And I could pick a left-right fight very well. And I will tell you, it'd be easier for me in a lot of ways. The right likes me for the most part. The left is a harder talk for me, but I want to try to find another way. I'm actually trying to follow in as much as I believe them my Christian social ethics. So let's see if it works. Governor Newsom announced today that Imperial County will reinstitute stay-at-home orders. So Imperial County, what is that? South of San Diego. Let's see. What's the name of the town? San Isidro? Do I remember right? Is that what's down there in the far south border, or is Imperial more inland, where you go to Mexicali and all the towns bordering that in the, the Salton Sea? God, I'm having to remember things. That's like one of my tricks. Dana always tells me people like that I always know a little geography, but I'm like a map geek. It's like, it should be like, oh God, he's talking about maps again. And you know how it gets when I get on maps. So, but I agree. We could shut down 50% of foreign military bases. And I do think government should be smaller and it should be more localized. I mean, if people want to have very intensive government, that's a decision to be made in the community, not at the national level. And I think we could agree with that because honestly, don't you want to know the people who you're working with? I mean, not that I would ever want that. That's why I live in the country. But if you're in a city and you have different needs, fine. I mean, you could have your neighborhood have it. One of the ideas I've had in a bigger sense is we shouldn't have cities of more than 50,000 people because you can't know anyone. There's something called the Dunbar Limit. You can only really really know like 200 people at most. And anything beyond that, you create a composite fake sketch of people. So if you make things smaller, then everyone will at least know someone. And you could take cities and have them be broken up into their different constituent neighborhoods, and then they could meet their needs, and they'd have to work differently rather than having sources be centralized. And that way, everyone gets a better cut of the pie because everyone will have more access to power, and it will be a lot harder to corrupt at that point because there's too many people to bribe. That's maybe the way pluralism could work much more. I mean, because honestly, I mean, pluralism is so ridiculous. In America, we say we have a country that has an honest operating democracy because we have 535 people making decisions for 330 million. I mean, the ancient tyrannies would love to have the amount of control a congressman have in their district, but people don't actually recognize this because we look at systems and we talk ideology without understanding what's actually happening beneath the hood of it. And we live in a different world, and we have to live with the reality of that. Either that, or we have to contemplate ways to change that reality. But assuming that you're not thinking of ways to eliminate millions of people, which the elites, by the way, do, and they are actually potentially working on. But assuming you and I don't do that, then we have to think a little bit more thoughtfully. And I agree, it's not our job to run the world, though. That's good, and we should rebuild manufacturing locally. Let's see. DJ asks, why can't it be both ways? We give a ton of money to corporations. The government could honestly build a better country and keep our presence. Maybe. There's a lot of people in the world who will be very sad when the America goes because it keeps a lot of places safe. So good to see you, DWR. Glad you're here. Rebuild Camden and Baltimore. If the country falls into anarchy, what will happen to home mortgages? Well, the problem with any debt is who's going to collect. And one of the things I would suggest to you, Dan, that what you need to recognize is that when there ceases to be a recognized legal authority, what will happen is that ownership will become a function of force and the ability to impose it. So debts will go away, but seizures will come back. And it will be like what happened in Seattle, where you will see the balance of force go in different directions. So if the economy breaks badly enough, or God forbid the virus comes back and is bad enough and we end up in Mad Max world, you end up with something that looks like Somalia circa 1991. Or if you prefer a European example, what happened in the Balkans. So don't be surprised if that is in fact where we go in the medium amount of time. And I think it's something that people should be preparing for and concerned about. And it's one of the reasons why I also highly recommend to A, be in an area that you like or think you will fit in, and B, try to fit into your community, even though you do have to contemplate certain risks. We are now in a world where instability has come to the country, and it's almost, in my opinion, it's actually probably for most people a greater threat than the virus, even as I actually believe there's going to be long-term problems from this. And like I said, I believe it's a virus designed to maim and reduce personal capacity, and I still don't have a lot of faith in the vaccines. I've just learned too much, and like I said, I'm probably one of the more paranoid people you'll ever meet, but it's because I've learned too many things that are true and awful. And I mean, I think they get away with a lot of things that are really bad because people fundamentally aren't as bad as their leaders are, and they can't contemplate that people would be that awful. Their worldview doesn't allow for that because they don't believe evil is real. They don't believe good is real. And like I said, there's a relativism that destroys these ideas so that there's a rational explanation for everything. But a lot of times, those are pretext rather than the reality of why people do things. And learning to see with a discerning eye, with wisdom is a really difficult thing. And it's a really disturbing thing. And it's painful and it hurts. And there's a reason why people don't want to do it. I mean, there are times my wife and I will sit up late at night and be like, how are we going to sleep knowing some of the things we know? And I don't have a very good answer for you about how you do that. And like even with this show, I asked you guys, at least I used to do when I was doing it, how you would listen to it every day, because I would be miserable listening to myself. I mean, but then again, I listen to people who are just as bad, and it's really hard. It's painful. It's ugly, and it's hurtful. But it's true. And it's in Christianity, you have this idea that you have to die to the world to be reborn in spirit, and shedding the expectations of this world, and learning to see through a different eye is really important. It's like being reborn as a child in some ways. That's where the sacrament of baptism really comes in. And what ends up happening in that is, when you're a child, we were talking about this earlier today, a child says things that are true. I mean, even when it's painful, any of you who are parents or who have, I've been around children, kids just have no filter. They just say things that are true and they don't defend lies. And yet, how much of our lives are spent defending lies, like things we know aren't true or half truths or all these things. And maybe we do so because, hey, we have to help our ally in this and we have to do this to protect our situation because we're all scared and we're anxious and we're uncertain. Economically, we could be destroyed. Socially, we could be destroyed. But as you defend lies, essentially everything around you becomes fake. And then before long, it's not long where your life doesn't make sense anymore. And I think that's where we're at. We have too many lies. And I understand the polite white lies of society. I get it. And civilization is always going to have some of that. But I think we've gone way too far that direction. And I really hope we find a way to get back from that. If we don't. But to your question, Dan, I'm sort of wandering here. Is mortgages, you know what? Can the bank collect them? I mean, if it gets bad enough, eventually you're going to own what you can hold. And I think that's where we're going to get to. And I would argue, actually, for the good of the country, that eventually, if I had absolute power, I would work to see everyone own a home. And I realized that would cause some problems. I realized some people would win in that scenario and some people would lose in that scenario. But I think in the aggregate, it would be better. But that's the thing. Like, this is why reform doesn't happen, right? People look at a system, and it could be a system that screws them 70%, but there's a weird psychological quirk where we will defend our last bar of food rather than like take if everyone could have like in fact there's an exact example of this. I want to say it right. That what they did was they had a study where if there was $100 bill at stake, they would have two people say they would split up. One person would make the decision about who would get what percentage, and the other person would decide if they would agree to the split. And what they found is when a 50-50 split was offered, everyone was fine with it. And if it was like 60-40 to 65-35, they wouldn't take it. But if someone went 90-10, they would say, no, you're screwing me. I'm not going to take it. And rather than getting $10 free money, they would try to screw the other person out of 90 because they didn't want to see someone else above them. And so this is one of the problems we deal with in our society, that we, the elites, go ahead and constantly rig these games where it's 90-10 for them, but they have you fighting 5-5 against one another, 3-7 all this time, and they know how to play these psychological tricks on us. And so what I would suggest is if you want to have a society of good and moral people who live and are successful, you need to give them certain foundations where they live in a world beyond finance. And I would suggest that if we went back to what was at the beginning of America, where people had homesteads to some extent and could live off the land, and that's why I argue for not having income tax, or I should say wage taxes to be accurate, and not having property taxes would be a good beginning. And I would go further in a mass reset, a debt amnesty that sees everyone own a house. There's more properties than there are people in this country, and you could divvy it up. And would some people lose assets? Sure, they would. But ultimately, we would have much more stability, and then we would reset the system. But people don't want to reset because everyone's afraid they'll be dragged down in it. So what happens, since nobody wants to reset, the contradictions go along just like a car with a check engine light that you keep driving. And so when it breaks down on the side of the road, you'll know why, because we were so invested in ourselves, we didn't look at what each other needed. And not what we wanted, incidentally, what we needed. That's how I look at it. And that's a very holistic view, but that's how I actually see it. Because if you don't have ownership in a society, if you have whole groups of people who have entitlement, victimhood, and all that, and that's why these things are pushed, all you're going to have is eventually anarchy and fighting, in which case the person who has all those assets, who did the right thing, is only going to end up being a victim anyway. So to the people who have some means and whatnot, I would suggest considering how you want to balance that all out. And if you decide to take the absolute position that, well, I got mine, you're going to have to work for yours, that's fine, but don't be surprised when the mob comes for theirs, because that's where you end up with. And unfortunately, that is the situation we face now. And for some people, they have more legitimate causes than others. Okay. Yeah, people do awful things to stay in power. Plantagenet's right. Absolutely. Just ask the Tudors, right? All right. Has anyone given a valid explanation? I don't know about that. Thoughts on the U.S. sending troops to the India-China border? That is fascinating. I did not know that was happening, Alexa, because I haven't read about that today. But if we are, it does seem like we're trying to create a tripwire. I will say this. The United States and India very likely may conclude a formal military alliance before the end of the year. Look at new pacts to be forming, and you will probably see a pact between, they're called the Quad, which is Australia, Japan, India, and the United States to contain China. And this is going to get ugly. because I know the U.S. has been doing a lot to encourage countries to kick out China from ports. I know there's some issues happening in Kenya right now. I also know that China is working to basically sustain a communist government in Tibet, where they're trying to move forward on that border. A lot of things are happening. Looks very 1937-ish, if you know what I'm saying. So we'll have to see what's happening. Let's see. Child's play historically on the deadly virus. That's true. Let's see. We will actually be forced to live off our lands. That's true, John. And I will tell you, if you're not figuring out how to work your land, you're really missing out. We spent so much time in that garden. And, even if you're just doing something small, let me give you a vote of confidence in that you learn skills that will save you later if you have to do more. And you should be stocking up on food still. The people who I listen to have been saying 2 months is a good amount to have. And I think that in the medium to near future, we have more shutdowns coming. They're going to keep the plants closed. There's going to be problems with that. You should expect there to be more shortages in food. And if you look at some of the Agenda 2030 stuff, the thing about the sort of global agenda is they put it out there and they say what it is. There's a couple interviews I see, like Ice Age Farmer does a lot on this, but you look at it, they want to limit your access to food because food is the means you control people. And that's what we're leading into. I mean, it's a world of insect proteins and all these other things. I don't know. I don't want to live in that world. I'm trying to get out before. You don't want to wait until you're pushed to a fight. You got to begin planning for your exit before things get bad. The time to leave is not when the house is on fire, It's if you have a house that looks like it's going to burn, you need to understand and look at that and be very smart and say, hey, it's time to head for higher ground, Let's see what we got here. It is a rotten disease herd, isn't it? What do I think with the fact they're already testing vaccines in Brazil and African countries? Let's see what happens, man. I don't know. I don't have a lot of faith in vaccines. I know too many bad stories about it, but we'll see what happens. Let's judge it based on the evidence. And I hope they succeed with something. I really do. We'll see what happens. Originally, East Congressmen represented 50,000 people. If we had that again, it would be a difficult Congress to buy. I don't think that's the case. You can buy state reps for that amount. But I think that we didn't have so much money. I really think that America, my own opinion, but I think the decade it was really lost was the 1910s. You look at direct election of senators. You look at the income tax. You look at the IRS being created. You look at the Federal Reserve. They made a lot of funny money before then. Things were working kind of better in a lot of ways. But hey, this is where we're at now. But I don't think congressmen represent people. I don't think the problem of how government works is that you listen to the people who are close to you, and that you end up with the issue of buying access. And look, I worked for congressional people, so I can kind of explain this a little bit. People, even good people who go to Congress, go with this idea that there's an issue they're usually passionate about. And when you run for Congress, a lot of times you're not running on a whole bunch of issues. You're running because you care about one thing so much you'll make any trade you need to for it. And you go to fight for that one issue, but you make trades on everything else. And unfortunately, those issues matter to other people. And you're not really looking at it from a holistic perspective. You're looking at it, I have to support this group who elects me. You have to look at it like, if you're a congressman, I represent 60% of people and the other 40% can rot. And what happens is that 40% doesn't go away. And that's the nature of democracy. It sets man against man and tribe against tribe, and it does so all the time. And eventually people figure out how to game the system. Jefferson wrote on this. He said that if we ever reached a point where people could vote themselves enough money to survive off the government, that you would eventually see 50% of the people try to go ahead and dominate the other group. And that's where we're at now. He actually talked about that. You can go back. The founders were real smart about these things because they saw how it happened. Britain was far bigger than America, and America was a rural country that was trying to be self-sufficient. And so you ultimately end up having to make a choice where you're going to have these corrupt systems of graft where you fight for nepotism, or if you're going to have radical decentralization. Those are your only real choices. I mean, if you try to get into empire, you're just going to delay the inevitable of breakdown. So I argue for decentralization. I think that's a better way to go forward. So we'll see. But I just don't really have a lot of faith in how that works. But and that's all right. I'll make the argument. People get mad at me. They're like, well, don't you think we deserve a voice? I'm like, yeah, that's why I hate democracy. I mean, ultimately, democracy gives you the illusion of something. If you want a real voice, you need decentralization. You need to be at a point where you can actually be a pain to someone who's ignoring you. Let's see what else we got here. I don't think Germany would move alone to an alliance with Russia or China if an axis comes in place with the whole EU. Well, here's the thing. So here's my logic for it, why, Jojo, is that Germany and France are the heart of the European Union. Where they go, everyone else will go. And they've been wanting independence in terms of foreign policy actions for a long time. They've been heavily involved in West Africa and whatnot. They have a lot of luxury goods that they need to sell to keep their economy afloat, especially in the post-COVID world. And America's going for full protectionism. So they're going to look for a huge market. So where can they go? India doesn't have the money, but China does. So China can buy all their products, and conversely, China can provide protection and provide some other goods, the cheap manufacturing they need to continue producing those goods. So that works out well. Plus, they already get a lot of their energy from Russia, as does China. So Russia ends up providing a little bit of a military shield, some military technology, and goods moving back and forth. Now, it's an awkward alliance in certain ways, and the Eastern Europe doesn't trust that, but the EU is already breaking between the nationalists in Eastern Europe, the globalist faction, I would say, the bureaucrats in Western Europe, and Russia being different. And a lot of times, as always happens in history, Poland's stuck between Germany and Russia. It's a problem for them. But Russia, on the one hand, doesn't really want to be too close to China. On the other hand, their whole economy is still based on petrol. And really, there's only one place that can buy the amount of fuel they need to sell, especially when they're interdicted by the United States Navy, and that's China. So if they can sell a little bit of fuel to Europe and then open up those sanctions and sell things to China, and China's aggression be pointed southward towards India or Taiwan or maybe even Japan, that would be a much better deal for Russia, where they would deal with that to buy themselves time, because Putin's a pretty canny actor. Conversely, for Putin to work with the U.S., Putin, the one thing you could have is maybe nationalism, but the nationalists are being thwarted in the United States, so that's not good. It could be Christianity if we were different structured, but frankly, the effort to destroy that is on the rise here. In a lot of ways, America would make more sense given where our leadership's taking it, working with China, which is what they would do and what the global front would kind of do. But the people themselves don't want it. And I think too many bridges have been crossed for that to still happen at this point. And I think Trump burned those bridges, which you could argue is a good or bad thing, depending what's out there. But we have to deal with the exigent reality. So now that you have this tripartite relationship, it makes too much sense for them all to work together, not the least of which because India and Russia have been having souring ties. So Russia's got to work with who it can work with to keep its own economy afloat. They're stuck in bed with China. I would say of all those people, I actually think the European Union has a better opinion of China than Russia does, but Russia's a victim of its geography just like anyone else. And the United States dissembling means the Anglosphere has to look at things very differently, and it's no accident you see islands working together and looking at India as the new bulwark of what's going to happen, and not even talking about the issues with the Middle East. But that's my read on geopolitics. Remember, things change very differently. Mussolini was like man of the year twice. So was Hitler before they looked at it a different way. And in a different world, you would have seen the fascists and the Democrats fight against the communists. But it didn't happen that way. And these things happened where things changed very quickly. But we'll see. It will end for the U.S. when the dollar is no longer the reserve currency. When that happens, we will resemble Weimar Germany. And remember, the dollar as a reserve currency happened with the Bretton Woods Conference, which led to eventually a sequence of conferences that led to the UN. And so the UN has been trying to push away from the dollar and U.S. support for a very long time. The dollar being broken will break the back of America. I do think it will happen in the next year or so. The debt, the lack of productive economy, growth in the debt, and the social unrest combined will probably be enough to kick it over the edge. We'll see what ends up happening. Have I heard of America? Okay, so let's see. Jen, good to see you. Hope all is well for you up there in Minnesota tonight. Absolutely. Do I believe there is a war between Judaism and Christianity? God, you guys are asking hard questions. My personal perspective on Judaism is that Judaism is an offshoot of Christianity, as the person of Christ fulfilled the prophet Messiah role of historical Judaic religion, so that Judaism was a later creation that was a rebuke of the Christian message that went down a different path. Because remember, Judaism really goes away for a while after the destruction of the temple by Rome, and it kind of goes underground for a very long time. And the people who pick it up, who come from the Khazars, who come from the sort of like the Turkish steppe area, really picked it up from a different place. Ashkenazi Jews are genetically not related to the Sephardim. So what I would argue is that it was a recalibration of an old religion that was set up in a way where it was basically set up as a counterpoint and antipode to Christianity. And having read some of the things that Talmud says about Goyim and Christianity, I would say that it tends to have a hostile relationship. So in my own perspective, I find the term Judeo-Christian cringeworthy. I believe Judaism, Islam, and Christianity are three very different religions that have a very different view. And frankly, they might not. I know people say they have the same God, but if you really understand the history of how these things were created, that's not necessarily true. I would argue that for those who are into esoterica, that Judaism and Islam are both lunar religions, whereas Christianity is a solar religion. And whether you think we should exist in the reflective light of the sun, that just goes ahead and depends on that, or if you want to be closer to that, really is a question to get into for deeper scholars. But I would say that historically, there has certainly been a lot of antipathy towards Christians by certain elements within the Judaism community, but that goes both ways. So I'll just leave it at that. I don't want to go too deep into those issues, but I would say that I do not believe they're the same religions, and I do believe that the relationship's so different. In Judaism, you have everything's under the law, right? And in Christianity, everything's under grace. So Christianity is a forgiving religion, whereas Judaism is a judging religion. And it's no accident that the social censors you see, groups like the ADL, are full of people making judgments about everyone about them except themselves, like hypocrites, like the old Pharisees did, and that's overwhelmingly you see people who subscribe to that faith, usually of the Reformed variety, in that. So I am not. I think that those things should be pointed out, but unfortunately, the one thing you're never allowed to criticize is the expression of that, and that's why there's more museums to the Holocaust than anything else in America, which is really curious considering it didn't happen here. So you really have to wonder what's the reason for that. But I'll let you draw your own conclusions. I will say a lot of people have been banned for drawing conclusions that made logical sense. Believe what you want, and I say this with no hatred toward Jews in any way, shape, or form. I actually respect the people, believe it or not. I think that they do an incredible job taking care of their own. I just wish that all people would learn not to do that at the expense of trying to attack others. And that's the Christian in me speaking. Let's see here. There are 3 steps in the downfall of a nation. First, there's religious apostasy. Yep, we're there. Second is moral awfulness. Agreed. And the third step is political anarchy. Dude, Richard, you're my man, dude. I'm here to support the Plantagenets. It's time to bring back the glorious revolution, man. Kick the Stuarts out. Go for it. Eric says, I love the idea of taxing revenue rather than profits. It would be a political non-starter, but a strong nudge for businesses to act more sustainably. Thank you, Eric. I appreciate that. Yeah, I've thought about this a lot, and I think one of the things you have to do is really understand the problem of bigness. That if you have something that's too large, it just ends up unaccountable, and I don't know how you get past that, but you can do things. Like in New England, I'll give you an example. This is really micro-urban planning, but it's important. What they did when they didn't want Walmart to take over and kill the small businesses was they couldn't ban a business, but they could ban businesses over a certain size. So they deliberately said you couldn't have a business that was over, I don't know what the number was, let's say 5,000 square feet or 10,000 square feet, whatever it is. And they would set things up so that they saved their small towns. And yeah, did it cost more money? It did, but they understood that when you invest money in a small business by buying a good or service, you ultimately see about 80 cents on the dollar come back to your community. Whereas when you give money to a box store, you see about 30 cents on the dollar on average. And so the question is, do you want to hollow out your communities? And a lot of communities did that because the box stores came in and offered really low prices. And they basically priced their competition out of the market using economies of scale. And then at the end of it, all businesses were Walmart or Amazon or whatever. And you have these opportunities where then you end up with a monopoly where you are a captive audience. And I'm afraid we are going to be seeing that soon. And if we want to get around that and have a society of innovation and artisans and real talent, which, if we're going to be in a UBI world, which I think we're going to be, you want that, you have to create spaces for people to economically succeed. And even if people have less, if what they have is better, isn't that worth it? I mean, that was the quality choice. And in our lives, Dana and I tried to do that. I mean, I spent $300 on a friggin' pressure canner, but I did so because it will last for my whole life. And is that a good investment? I think so. I mean, if I found people who wanted to go in with me, I'd buy a freeze dryer. Those things cost $2,000, but I'd be able to preserve all my food for 25 years with just some Mylar. That'd be awesome. I can't afford that, but hey, if you want to get in on it, talk to me and maybe we'll set up something. I think that'd be friggin' great. But you have to make those choices, quantity versus quality. And we made a choice to be cheap and disposable. And the problem is that no one cares about cheap and disposable. You end up in a world full of junk. I mean, the biggest growth thing we have are landfills. And this is a nice chance for left and right wing values to come together. The right values of thrift and economy with the left wing value of sustainability and stewardship, for the environment. These are not contradictory values. These are things that should come together. Good policy brings people together. Bad policy sets people apart. And, as an urban planner, as a town manager, I had to know how to do those things. And I talk with people who I fundamentally disagree with on a lot of issues, I have to be able to talk to you, and we have to be able to talk to each other. But now we're not allowed to because certain people are said as being evil, and it's no accident the people that get attacked the most are often some of the smartest and most thoughtful people out there, because really the mob is given wisdom. And if you want to have mob rule, well, just keep voting for what you've been getting. If you want to do something different, I will tell you the democratic system is not going to allow it. And I don't mean democratic in terms of the party. I mean democracy. Our republic is not going to permit that. The financial interests will never allow real opposition to congeal again. And you're going to have to deal with that reality and how far you're willing to go with it. I'm willing to go incredibly far, dangerously far, but that's me. My argument to you is to ask the question, what is really important to you and what are you willing to pay for it? Because now we're coming to a situation where the question is, what sacrifices are you willing to make? You know, and that's what we got to do. Kennedy asked that, and then they shot him. Take that for what it's worth. Let's see. Disagree with fiat money being necessarily evil. If dollar supply must increase, distribute equitably, forgive productive debt like mortgages, or restrict the spending on necessary projects. The problem, Omegas, is someone's got to control that fiat money. That's where the evil comes into. You could create a system that's less bad than this one, no question about it. But ultimately, it's used far more cynically. And I would have less of a problem with fiat money than the usurious use of interest in the lending process. I think that that's a big problem. So we'll see. It's a Friday night. Have some scotch. My bottle's empty. I never bothered to refill it. I mean, honestly, the last time I had scotch, I got so drunk that I felt like crap for the whole weekend. But I may have a beer next time you see me out here. I'll go that far in that. And to tell you the truth, I mean, not that I should say this, but it's true. I actually enjoy weed a lot more than liquor. But that's just me. You can't put your mind in a different space. Okay. Firo, good to see you. Hope all is well with you. Zach, good to see you as well. One of our politicians has been sacked and raided by the federal police with allegations of gyrations to China. He's praised China in its response and saying we need a new world order, right? Where Scott Hall would need him. Hey, yo, right? Yeah, bad impression, right? But ultimately, yeah, we are dealing with this creation of this entity. You know, they want to have one world government. It's coming. I mean, you can see it. I mean, this is being pushed every way out there, and if people stand in the way of it, they're going to be targeted. And you know, the thing is, you may not see how it's coming because, you know, true warfare is committed by subterfuge and deceit. And so there's a lot of things that look like they're just events happening. But when you start to see the connect the dots, you start to realize someone knocked over a domino somewhere at the beginning of this. It was kind of obvious to people who were smart, but most people aren't smart. And the problem is it's hard to be smart when you're not getting good information. And we don't. We really don't. And that's why it's so hard to tell you guys the story. I can tell you these macro views, but people always want like very explicit details. And I'd love to give them to you, but I don't believe them because we fixate on details. Like even the lab reports I've read. I mean, some of them were so smart, but I've never understood why this virus didn't end up being way worse than it was. And I can't help but conclude maybe there's some rigged data somewhere in there that made me think it was going to be worse than it was, or that maybe it's just the other shoe hasn't fallen yet. But I really do wonder, because I want to believe scientists don't lie, but I knew scientists. I had friends who went to Ivy League schools who were involved with the climate change stuff, and they would get paid to produce content that had certain outcomes, and they made it because, you know, that's how they make a living, you know? And look, we all do this. I write for my audience too. I mean, when I wrote The Coming Civil War and all those books, I know my audience leans right of center, and I gave them a lot of red meat. I mean, if you read it as a leftist, you probably never want to listen to me again. But that happens, and because of that, I mean, it gets real hard to tell the narrative, but that's deliberate. So I spend a lot of time talking about foundational principles these days, because if you don't root in that, you end up in the fight. And it's real easy to end up in the fight, Lord knows. I mean, we got into a conversation today. We were talking about the Confederate flag and the causes of the Confederacy, and the people on the right were like, it's all about economics, and the people on the left were, it's all about slavery. And the truth is, none of us know because none of us were there. We were imposing our own thoughts. And this is the imperialism of the modern day, that we think that the past gives a damn about how we look at the world, and yet everyone does this. This is why narrative exists. But we don't really know. We never will know. We appropriate symbols, you know, but that's why we got to be very clear about what we mean today. And I think it's more helpful to focus on the future than the past. But I do think we should seek truth. And in that we do have to look for the past and have the accrued wisdom. Anyway, let's see. I am half Jewish, John. Tom, you and I should have a talk. Well, yeah, sure. You can. Look, if you guys want to send me something, an email, newalbion at protonmail.com. And you know, and look, I will tell you something before we go super deep into it. I have a lot of Jewish friends, believe it or not. I've been around. I mean, look, my family's from New York. We know Jews. And it's not that all Jews are bad, and it's not that all Jews are good. It's been my observation that Jews are incredibly fierce in protecting their tribe sometimes, and do so by taking down threats that don't exist before they can come into being. Maybe that's a result of the history. I get that part of it. It's a difficult situation, and I would welcome a situation where these issues do not come up anymore. I know in 1,000 years of European history it didn't happen, but I also know that there were a lot of examples where Jews were used as scapegoats by monarchs who found it convenient to have them as bankers. And I will say that there's a part of me in my gut that thinks deep down that as much as we kind of see that whole banker Jewish thing that's put out there, that there's someone behind them pulling more strings. And I think that that is absolutely the case, and people do what they have to do to survive. And the truth is that there has always been these difficult relationships, but we can talk about it. We can absolutely talk about it. But I will say, just in my experience, that any time, and you can look at this, you can look at Black Lives Matter, you can look at any of these rioting organizations. I mean, let's just be honest with you. If you look at the media, right, and you look at the corporate heads, and you look at these groups of people who are out there, who are behind these organizations that are causing the riots in the streets, you will notice a disproportionate influence of people of Judaic background. And I think that needs to be answered for, but you're not allowed to ask the question. And I'd welcome an answer, and they'd say, oh, well, we support justice. I'm like, well, who's justice? Because divide and conquer is pretty cynical if that's what it is. Or, maybe it's an obsession with equality and this idea that you blend in and camouflage, that you are a minority group always in a majority culture. And so what you want to do is have a lot of minority groups in an area so that you can hide your people. I get that. And that's fine if people want to be honest about it. But I think that a lot of times what happens is that there isn't honesty about it, and you're not even allowed to have the conversation. So I welcome any conversation with Jews, with blacks, with Asians, with Arabs, with Muslims, with anyone. I mean, if you want to talk about your issues, we'll talk about your issues, and I can talk about my issues. Lord knows you need a full psychology textbook to cover everything going up on here. So I think that those are things that we should be able to talk about. And if we can talk about them honestly, and let me say my perspective on this, every group has a right to their beliefs. Every group has a right to self-interest, individually, collectively, ethnically. I have no problem with any of that. I just don't think we have the right to suppress others from having their own. And I think that's the pathway to peace. And whether that is through combination under a set of laws we can agree under, or separation because we can't, I'm fine with either. What I'm not okay with is this idea of supremacy, where one group's suppressing the other. And ultimately, we are being set up in a situation where one group is going to do that to another, or one coalition. And I want to try to walk away from that before it gets really bad. My thought, we'll see if it's right. So thank you for that question. I mean, and Lord knows I'm going to get shut down for answering these questions, but I'm trying my very best while I can to answer you honestly and thoughtfully and with no malice toward anyone. I really don't. I mean, I do have a problem with certain belief structures. I mean, but I have to be clear. I believe Christianity is the one true faith, and I believe everything else is apostasy. I am trying as a human being to be respectful of people for having disagreements, but fundamentally, I'm not lukewarm in my commitment to it. I mean, I could come up here like a preacher, and sometimes, Lord knows I do, trying to convince you of why I believe this is the true faith. And I make what I think are compelling arguments, at least they convince some people. But I don't try to do that with this show. I just happen to go there because I can't go away. Sometimes that's the real answer for why I do things the way I do. And people would say, well, don't you think that having faith will lead to people fighting each other? And the answer is yes, of course it will. But the answer is it's worth it sometimes, because at some point you realize that faith in something being real is something, sometimes you have to fight for something. It's worth the cost you pay, whether it's in blood, tears, sweat, whatever it is, that you realize there are things worth fighting for. And what I would suggest to each and every one of you is that you know what you're fighting for, why you're fighting, and actually fight for things that are worth it. I'm not someone who's out there as a pacifist. I don't believe that. And frankly, I don't believe Jesus believed that. He may have said, blessed are the peacemakers, but he also said, I come with a sword. And I think that's very important to remember that. And that, the sanctified version where we place our lives in safety as the highest good misses that there are other values that we need to balance against those. And what is more important in any given space and time is a conversation we need to have. And it's a focus of this broadcast always that we ask those questions. For instance, if everyone would want to have a war with the bankers, I'd risk my life and limb for that. I would do it in a heartbeat, and I'd be very happy to do so. And if they ever come after me, I want you to remember I said that to them because I'm blaming them. If anything ever happens to me, I blame the Fed. And I'm going to tell you right now, that's just my thought. But we'll see. learn to impose our reason. So John writes, the reason inflation has been kept under control is to protect debt. I agree with that. Massive inflation, which classical economics would predict, would also allow people to pay off mortgages for penny on the dollar. That's true, and that people would have ownership. And you're right, John. I could not agree more that they are defending the status separation rather than allowing people for that. So I propose selecting Congress by lot and increasing the size. I'm not a fan of Congress, but I would say your proposal, in my opinion, is far better than what we have now. Let's see here. Thoughts on the July 4th. Good to see you, John. Glad you're checking in. On the July 4th event with John Mark and Kurt Doolittle, their updates are sketchy. Not sure if it would be smart to head to Richmond. You got to look at that Hayes guy, too, who's involved with that. I would not be in a public gathering on July 4th. Just my thought. I mean, I might go to a little fireworks show in the middle of nowhere in Maine, but there are too many funny things around these things happening. I understand people want to be heard. That's their right. I just don't trust it. I've heard too many things that sit poorly with me, and my spidey senses are tingling, you know? So let's see here. Let's see. What is the more corrupting force, money or power? Question. What do I think is more corrupting, money or power? Money. And the reason why is because money makes you treat people as objects. People can have power and use it responsibly, but money is tricky because money, I think, makes people think that they're not making a decision. Like, a lot of people present economics as amoral, right? But it's not. There's a ton of decisions embedded in it. And as much as it annoys me, and it really does annoy me, the one thing the left does do with critical theory sometimes is they break things down really intelligently, and the way that happens is worth looking at. But power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think that it is the loss, like Richard was saying earlier, it is the loss of a moral base, and that money erodes the moral base because it makes you make too many compromises. Every person reaches a point where they make so many compromises where what starts out as a good cause ends up being something evil, and then the ends justify the means. You got to be very careful when you go down that road and know why you're doing it. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. We all end up on that road sometimes, and sometimes maybe it's worth it. I can't judge that. It's not my job to judge you. But I think you need to be aware when you're doing it. Let's see what we got here. We will burn down the system. Yeah, no, I've read what BLM has to say. They're orthodox Marxists who want to destroy fatherhood. It's great, you know. I mean, you would think, if you really care about Black lives, I mean, God, I hate to rant about Black people, but here's the thing: if you really want to fix the Black community, fatherhood's probably the single biggest epidemic. Absent fathers from that community, and yet you have Black Lives Matter arguing that you don't want fathers in the family. So what's it really about, huh? This isn't about Black people being cared for. This is about Black people being exploited as per usual by a little bit of money instead of giving up their chance for something far greater. And they get used over and over again in that way. And it's really sad, and it's really cynical. And, sadly, too many of them go for it. And they're serving as a cover for things that aren't about, because this isn't about George Floyd. Everyone agreed what happened to George Floyd's terrible, pretty much. I mean, maybe a few people don't, but 99% of people, including anyone who looked at that tape. I mean, if the tape is what it appears to be, there's no justification for that. It's just how it is. Let's see what else we got here. Okay, we're going to continue. Virginia Department of Health is now encouraging residents to snitch on people. Yeah, that's what we're going to deal with. It's East Germany, man. People are going to narc on one another. And that's the thing. I mean, the government wants to be an intermediary. Remember, the government is a referee who wants to be bought off. That's all it is. And if you understand that, you understand why government has to be limited in power. City folk are definitely fleeing to rural pastures to escape collapse and destruction. And Marina, glad to see you. I'm glad you're enjoying the books. Thank you for getting that. And for anyone who's interested, we have all the different books over here. I can send you digital copies of anything you want. So we could do that with New Albion or any of the other things. But hopefully you guys enjoyed the show. And, I covered things. And if I was a little harsh on a couple things, I apologize. I try to answer you honestly. It's the best I can do for each and every one of you. I'm going to go ahead and lead with a prayer here. If you have last-minute questions, now's the time to get them in. I would be happy to share them with you. Any other answers? So let me just say this. Heavenly Father, I pray that as we come into this weekend, that everyone be kept safe, that, we find a way to seek truth and we seek goodness, and we ask those questions and learn to hear that still small voice within the conscience that is invested in each of us, so we can find our way to truth and greater reality. And I want everyone to know that whatever our failures, whatever our difficulties, no one is beyond redemption. No one is beyond the gift of grace. And that we remember that we can share that. Each of us has that gift to us, and that everyone, it's a gift we should try to share with others. And in repentance, we can find the ability to become better people and have a better world, and trust that you will be faithful to us as you ever have been as we seek a way to build a better world. So in Jesus' name, I thank you for that. Amen. So that is my prayer for the evening, and I really think that that's absolutely the truth. And hopefully you guys enjoyed the show. So we'll go through it, and if people have other things, and if you have any questions, by the way, feel free to ask me things off air. You're more than welcome to do so. I usually write, and I should have a little bit of time this weekend. Like I said, Coronavirus Central at pm.me. I will be back Monday evening at 7 p.m. as per usual. I'll probably try to check out some of the virus stuff today, this week, and I'll probably have a little bit closer to what I'm trying to do is have a pamphlet middle of next week about where to go from this. So definitely we'll be working very hard on that. So that's very good. And other than that, God bless you guys. Have a great evening. So always my pleasure. Thank you for spending some time with me this Friday. And for all you who are listening afterwards, I hope you enjoy it. Join us on a live stream soon. We try to answer every question you have out there. Where else can you get that on the internet? Especially when you get honest answers. So hopefully you all appreciate it. God bless.